Hi everyone, welcome back to my channel. I'm Huck. Today I am doing my December wrap-up. So these are all of the books that I read in December. December was a pretty good reading month for me. I read 12 books and I think I liked a lot of them. It started out a little bit rocky for me, but it ended strong. So overall, I ended the month feeling pretty good about my reading. So let's get started. So the first book that I finished in December was Burn Bright by Patricia Briggs. This is the 5th book in the Alpha and Omega series, which is a spin-off series from her Mercy Thompson series. And this is an urban fantasy that follows werewolves primarily, although there are also other magical creatures as well. In this, our two main characters are Anna and Charles. They are werewolves. They live with a pack of werewolves in Montana. And at the beginning of the book, a very old, powerful werewolf is murdered, and then they have to kind of uncover what happened, why she was murdered, and they discover this larger conspiracy that might threaten their pack. And this book, I started it out as a physical book. I actually started this in October and then put it down, not because I wasn't liking it exactly, but I wasn't really in the mood for it and there were just other things I wanted to prioritize. And then in December, I decided to finish it because I didn't want to have it like roll over into the next year, but I wasn't really prepared to DNF it. So I actually listened to the rest of it as an audiobook, and I actually really enjoyed it as an audiobook. Urban fantasy isn't usually my favorite like fantasy subgenre, and I'm not actually a huge fan of werewolves, although I like werewolves better than vampires. But this is just a series that I've been following for a really, really long time. I started reading the original series, the Mercy Thompson one, probably when I was in high school or so. So this is one that I've been following for a long time. But I do feel like this series has slowly been losing me over time, because I think I've just been finding more books that I like better. I've been finding new authors and new fantasy, and I feel like this series may not be worth it to me to continue. Something else though about this series and the Mercy Thompson series is that it tries to incorporate a lot of different like cultures and mythologies into it, which is cool, but I don't think it's necessarily always done very well. And so there are times where I definitely feel like this series may be getting into like appropriative territory, but there are also times where I'm like, I don't feel like I know enough about it to be able to really tell if it is appropriation. So this series also just kind of always makes me like a little uncomfortable when I'm reading it. So all of that being said, this may be the last book in this series that I read. She's still releasing books in this series, but I'm not sure if I'm really going to be continuing to keep up with it because of all of those things. The next book that I read in December was Muse of Nightmares by Laini Taylor, and I finally read this book. I've been meaning to read this since July this year, or last year at this point. This is just going to be so confusing. But I read the first book, Strange the Dreamer, in June, I think. And then I got this almost immediately because Strange the Dreamer, I was just like really conflicted about how I felt about that book. So my strategy was read the second book to help me clarify how I feel about the first one. Because I was hoping that, you know, this is a duology and this is the second book. So I was hoping this would kind of wrap things up and help me to figure out how I feel about this series as a whole. And to explain kind of what this series is about, although I feel like a lot of people have probably heard of the Strange the Dreamer duology, but Strange the Dreamer starts with following Laszlo Strange, who is a librarian who's obsessed with this lost city of Weep. And most people believe that Weep is a myth, that it doesn't really exist, but then one day people from Weep show up and say that their city had been under a curse and kind of had been lost to time, lost to memory, but it has now been kind of resurrected from that curse, and now they need scholars and people with certain specialties to come help them kind of rebuild their city and solve a mystery kind of in their city. And so Laszlo gets a chance to go to this city that he has been obsessed with for so long. So that's what starts off the first book, and this is the second one. Reading the second book, I did not feel like it really cleared up a whole lot for me. I still felt extremely conflicted about this book. There are a lot of things that I really didn't like about it. There are definitely things that I think it did well. I think that it is generally well written. I think that it creates characters that are really engaging, and then that's also one of the things that was most frustrating to me, is that there were some characters in here that I just hated so much. And while that made it really unpleasant to read, because I just had this like really extreme reaction to some of these characters, some of them I just like hated so much, some of them were just so frustrating and I was really mad at them. I also think that in some ways that shows that those characters are written well, that they're able to really elicit strong emotional reactions. And so that's kind of like why I was feeling so conflicted, because there were a lot of things that I do think it did well, but it made it a very unpleasant reading experience for me, and I didn't really like any of the characters. But one thing that I do want to mention that I think is specifically an issue that this book has is the way that it handles suicide, because at the end of the book there is a character that commits suicide, and in the context, that character's suicide is kind of framed as a way of gaining freedom and reaching happiness, and I think that that is really a problem, to frame suicide as that way of like finding happiness and freedom and fulfillment. So that was my one thing that I was just like, oh, that's actually like problematic, the way that they framed suicide in this story. But overall, I did not enjoy this book. I actually already filmed a spoilery discussion about this, which will be going up sometime soon after I do all of my like yearly wrap-up videos. But that one, I kind of talked out a lot of my feelings, and by the end of it, I kind of realized that I actually really did not enjoy this book. So I think that even though there are things that I think it did well overall, I really don't enjoy this book or this series. Next, I listened to Of Sorrows and Such as an audiobook by Angela Slater. This is a novella that is following a town where there are witches and shapeshifters, but both witches and shapeshifters are persecuted in this world, so they have to kind of hide themselves. Our main character is a witch and she is a healer, which is why I was originally interested in this book. And in this story, there is a shapeshifter who gets caught, and then that kind of reveals the presence of shapeshifters and witches in this community, in this village, which then kind of forces their hand and makes the witches and shapeshifters have to make a lot of decisions about kind of how are they going to survive, what will they sacrifice or not. And this one, it was a novella, it was very short, it felt almost like slice of life in a way, because it was just sort of this one moment in time in these characters' lives. And overall, I enjoyed this. I think I gave it 4 out of 5 stars. It may have been more like 3.5, but overall, I really liked it. I liked it enough that I would read something else by this author. I would be interested in reading a full novel, just because I did enjoy what I got out of this story. Next, I listened to the audiobook of The Queen of Nothing by Holly Black, which is the final book in the Folk of the Air trilogy, which I know everybody has been talking about recently. And this series is one that has never been a favorite of mine. I don't necessarily like it that much, but it just has really high entertainment value, so I have been continuing to read this series. So I just wanted to kind of see how it all ended. I had fun listening to it because, as I said, it just has like very high entertainment value, but I still am very frustrated with Jude as a main character. Most of my notes are just about being like, why would you make this plan? This is such a stupid plan. Or being like, you're already just making terrible choices or things that just make no sense. Again, Jude is so easily tricked or fooled, and Jude just continues to be bad at all of the things that she repeatedly tells us she is amazing at. But also, there's like a prophecy that we find out about in this book, and to be honest, I feel like the prophecy was like really obvious as to what like the solution was. But one of the things I did enjoy was there's one scene where I was listening to this book and I was just like, oh my god, this book just turned into Mean Girls. And it just like, that one moment just like made the entire book for me. If you've read the book, I hope you recognize what like moment I'm talking about, because I was just like, it's Mean Girls, this is amazing. But even though I did find some elements of this book kind of frustrating or predictable or whatever, it was a lot of fun to read. I didn't find that it was too short or an unsatisfying ending like I know some people have talked about, but also I was far less invested in the characters and their relationships. So really my standards for this ending to the series were pretty low, as long as I was entertained by it, which I was. So I think I gave this 3.5 out of 5 stars. Next, I read a whole trilogy of graphic novels, which are the Witch Boy graphic novels by Molly Knox Ostertag. So the first book is The Witch Boy, the second is The Hidden Witch, and the third is The Midwinter Witch. And these are like middle grade graphic novels that are following this family where all of the women in the family are witches and all of the men are shapeshifters. But our main character is a young boy named Aster in the family, and he does not want to be a shapeshifter, he wants to be a witch. And his family does not think that he can or should be a witch because he is a boy. And I really enjoyed this series. I read the first one kind of on a whim because I happened to be waiting for somebody and I was hanging out at a library waiting to meet someone. So I picked up a graphic novel because, you know, it'll be quick to read while I'm waiting. And this is the one I picked up. I really enjoyed it. It was just so cute, and I just, like, there was just so much that was so good about this that I immediately, like, ordered the entire trilogy so that I could have it on my shelves. I really loved our main character, Aster, and watching him, you know, learn more about himself and accept himself, and also just kind of learning to deal with his family as they are learning to accept him, and accept who he is. And it just was such a good series, and it's really about like accepting yourself, accepting other people as they are, and not forcing people to be trapped by these like gendered traditions. And in this, actually, my favorite character in this series is Aster's friend Charlie, which I wonder, yeah, that's Charlie on the cover. She's the best. She was definitely the best part of this series for me. There is this one part in the series where Aster is like trying to figure something out, and he's kind of like going down this like rabbit hole in his thinking, and Charlie just like tells him to just like stop, and she's like, "You're being dumb." And I'm just like, she's the best, and that's the best kind of friend who will just be like, "No, you're being dumb." I loved her. There are just so many things that she did and said that I absolutely loved her so much, and she was the highlight of this series for me. But I just thoroughly enjoyed the entire series. I gave each of these 4 out of 5 stars. Next, I listened to the audiobook of A Dash of Trouble by Anna Mariano. This is the first book in the Love, Sugar, Magic series, which is a middle grade series about this family living in Texas who have baking magic. And in this first one, it's all centered around them getting ready for the Day of the Dead. And our main character is the youngest sister in the family, and she doesn't know that her family has magic. So she kind of suspects that they're hiding something from her, and it's about her like finding out about magic and then kind of trying to figure out how to use magic, and the hijinks that she gets into trying to figure that all out on her own. So for this one, there were some things that I really enjoyed about it and some things that I didn't really like so much. The things that I didn't like as much about it is mostly that I didn't really like the main character. I thought that she did a lot of things that were really like dangerous and reckless and selfish to an extent that I thought didn't make sense. Because of course she's a child, and so some of those characteristics can make sense, but there were definitely things that she did that I was like, at her age, she should be able to think this through better than this and not do things that are so dangerous. And also, actually, she felt a lot younger than she's actually meant to be, because I think that they said she's supposed to be around 11, and I didn't realize that until like pretty far into the book when they mentioned it at some point, because up until that point, in my head, based on the way that she acted, I thought that maybe she was 7 or something. She just seems very young and immature for how old she's actually supposed to be. And there's a lot of this like kid logic that happens in this book about like not telling parents or not telling adults and we're just gonna figure it out on our own, which kind of happens in most middle grade books to some extent. But again, there's like a threshold for that, and I felt like this kind of went over the threshold of believability, or the threshold of what made it, like, the character, for me, able to like that character. I also didn't like that I felt like there were no consequences for her, but there were also things that I really enjoyed about this book. It is really cute, and I really liked the baking magic element of it, and I really loved her family. Her whole family is just so great, and I love the way that they're written, and she has, I think, 4 older sisters. She's the youngest, and I loved how each of the sisters really had their own distinct personality, and then I think she also did a really good job of having very distinct relationships between each of the sisters. So I think the family dynamics in it were written really well, and that was probably my favorite part of the story. So overall, I gave this one 3.5 stars. Next, I read The Queens of Innisleer by Tessa Gratton. This is an adult high fantasy that is a standalone, which is pretty rare to come by, and it is a retelling of Shakespeare's King Lear. But in this story, it really revolves a lot more around the 3 sisters and focuses less on King Lear himself. And for me, I think that that made a big difference for me, just because I've never been a huge fan of King Lear as a play, and I think part of that was because I was never that interested in King Lear himself. But in this one, it not only focused on the 3 sisters, which I thought was interesting, but also really fleshed out these characters and made them and their dynamics so interesting, and I really loved this book. There are so many things about this that I thought were incredibly well done. It is written beautifully. It has wonderful atmosphere. It has nature magic in it, which of course I love. There is like a language of trees, so the people can speak to the trees, which is amazing. All of the characters in this, I think, are just so incredibly well written. They feel so like real and so raw, and you can really like understand all of them so well. So even though most of the characters in this book, most of them are pretty like morally gray, most of them are not the most like likable characters. There aren't a lot of characters that you can really just go like, you're a good person, I like you. Because most of them are really morally gray, but I loved these characters so much, and I was so invested in them. I could really understand them and just empathize with them, even when they like made bad decisions or did terrible things. You just really understood them so well and cared about them so much. And to me, this book was just like really emotional. Like it had me, like there's so much like emotional upheaval for me reading this book. I do want to mention a couple of content warnings for this though. Specifically, there is animal sacrifice, and there's actually like kind of a gross animal sacrifice scene. There also is suicide in this book, and the one that I especially want to mention is miscarriage and infertility. That is a major piece of one of the characters' stories throughout the book, and there are actually some very intense scenes of miscarriage where you're like with the character while they're going through it, and it is just a constant theme throughout this character's story, so it's not even like you could just skip one scene and it would be over. So I just really wanted to mention that that is something to be aware of going into this. But I thought this book was incredibly well done. I'm really excited to read more of Tessa Gratton's books, and her new book that is going to be coming out very soon that is also set in this world. I gave this 4.5 out of 5 stars. On Goodreads, I think I rated it 5 stars, but I just, in my mind, my personal rating is 4.5. I took off the half star just because there were times where this book felt like it was kind of a slog to get through, because like the world and atmosphere of it is so well done and it is beautifully written, but it is very densely written, and there were times where it definitely was a little bit of a slog. It wasn't like the easiest book to read. I still really enjoyed it, but I just took off half a point because it was a little bit tough to get through. Then I finally finished Once Upon an Enchanted Forest by various authors. This is an anthology of 10 short stories by multiple authors, which are all around romances set in like magical forests and usually involve some kind of like witchcraft magic in them. And this anthology was okay to me. Like, I think that anthologies and short stories are a bit of a hard sell for me. There were 2 stories from this that I really liked though. The first one was Wolfswood by Morgan Jensen, and that one I really liked her writing and the atmosphere that she had, and unfortunately she doesn't have any other published work. I think this short story may be her first published work, but I would read more from her if she had more books, so maybe I'll keep an eye on her to see if she publishes anything in the future. And then the other one that I liked, of course, was Juliet Marillier's short story, which was called In Wraithwood. And something that I kind of found with a lot of these stories is most of the ones that I didn't like as much were because they were trying to do too much in a short story. Because this is a very short format. Most of these short stories were around like 20 to 30 pages, and you can get a certain amount of story in there, but especially since these were romances, I think it can be really difficult to have a full and believable romance in such a short period of time. And the ones that I thought did it the best were the ones that didn't try to do too much, that they didn't try to have too much extra plot or world building. They had just enough so that you really understood what was happening, but also they didn't try to have too much of the relationship. So they either were stories that did like just the beginning of the relationship but didn't try to have an entire arc, or they were ones that you were starting with characters that had already previously known each other, so there was a believability in the relationship because these were characters who already knew each other and had a history together and were now developing a romantic relationship. So there were a few stories that I found in here that I enjoyed, but I didn't give this one a rating just because I don't really know how to rate an anthology since there are, you know, so many different stories and authors. Then I read Spinning Silver by Naomi Novik. This is another standalone adult fantasy. This is another retelling, though this is a retelling of Rumpelstiltskin. And we're following 3 main characters that are all women who are kind of put into these impossible situations and have to be really clever to survive and to get themselves out and protect the people that they love. I thought this was a really interesting twist on the retelling, and I liked seeing how these 3 main characters were really clever and resourceful, and how these women who start out really not knowing each other at all, how their stories interact and then how they end up supporting each other in various ways, to various degrees throughout the story. I think one of the things that I was most excited and apprehensive about going into this is that one of the main characters, Miriam, is Jewish, and I was really excited to find Jewish rep in a fantasy book, but I was very apprehensive as to how that rep was going to go, because I've been burned before. But overall, I think it was done very well. There were a lot of times reading from her character and even reading about her parents, that I could tell that I was like, oh, that's very like Jewish logic, the way that she would like think about things. She talks about, you know, Jewish values and Jewish law throughout the story. She continually like celebrates Shabbat. It's like, I liked how it was consistently woven into her character throughout the story in some more overt ways and more subtle ways. And I think that the rep was actually done fairly well. The only thing that I didn't like about it was just kind of the basic premise of it being that her family are money lenders. And I know that that is like historically accurate. A lot of Jewish people had to be money lenders because that was one of the only occupations that was available to them for a long time for various reasons that I'm not going to go into right now. So it is historically accurate in that way. But there are kind of like 2 things that bother me about this. One, just being that for me reading it, I kind of felt like the whole time I was just sort of waiting for the other shoe to drop, because the association between Jewish people and like money has been going on for a long time and feeds into a lot of stereotypes about Jewish people and a lot of prejudice and things like that. So the whole time reading this, I just kind of felt like I was on edge, like waiting for something to go wrong in the way that it was represented. And I didn't think that anything ended up going wrong, so I think the rep was done pretty well. It just sort of put a shadow over my reading experience of this book, and I could tell that the parts of the story where she was not like in her town and she wasn't working as a moneylender, and when she was kind of like in the fairy realm, those were the parts that I enjoyed a lot more, because there wasn't that like shadow of her being a moneylender. She just got to be like any other character who's in a fantasy story. And that kind of leads into my other issue with this, being that, so this is something that I think happens to a lot of different like minority groups, is that when they are included in books or like fantasy books or stories, suddenly it has to be like historically accurate, that they aren't allowed to just have a purely fantasy story as if it has to suddenly be historically accurate as a way of like justifying their existence in the story. And so that's just something that I found kind of frustrating about it. Like, I understand that her being a moneylender was kind of integral to the plot of the story, but I just kind of wish that she had been allowed to be a character in a fantasy story and also be Jewish, but not have to have her existence be justified by this historical accuracy. So anyways, overall, I do think that this was done well. I did enjoy this story. I wasn't super attached to any of the characters, but I thought I did enjoy all of them. You know, I liked them. So I gave this 4 out of 5 stars. And the last book that I read in December was The Tea Dragon Festival by Katie O'Neill. This is the companion prequel to The Tea Dragon Society. It is a graphic novel about these little tea dragons that grow tea leaves on their horns, and it's just so cute and so wholesome, and I actually really loved this one even more than the first one. And I think that part of it is because I just liked the setting of it. This one is set in the mountains, and our main character goes like foraging in the forest, which I just loved those scenes. But I really loved the alpine tea dragons. We get to learn about a few new kinds of tea dragons that are specific to the mountains, and I just thought they were even cuter than the ones in the first book. And I also just really enjoyed the message of this book, because I think a lot of it is about valuing your own contributions. And I just really enjoyed this, and it was a wonderful way to end the month and end the year. I gave this 5 out of 5 stars. So that is all for my December wrap up. Happy New Year to all of you. I hope you all had a wonderful New Year's. Thank you all for watching, and until next time, bye.